Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker. We begin today with growing tensions between the U.S. and China. 3 U.S. officials tell NBC News new intelligence suggests China is considering providing artillery and ammunition to Russia, which would mark a significant development in the war as the fighting in Ukraine enters its second year. These U.S. officials did not say what specific evidence they had to support the intelligence. But CIA Director Bill Burns telling CBS News over the weekend the U.S. was confident Chinese leadership was considering the move. He says no final decision has been made by China, and there is no evidence of actual shipments of lethal aid to Russia at this time. President Biden's national security advisor Jake Sullivan told Chuck yesterday any shipment of lethal aid to Russia would only alienate China on the world stage.
I don't think it is in China's interest to do this. I think it would alienate them from a number of countries in the world, including our European allies, and it would put them foursquare into the center of responsibility for the kinds of war crimes and bombardments of civilians and atrocities that the Russians are committing in Ukraine. Their weapons would, in effect, be used for the slaughter of people in Ukraine. So I think it would be ill-advised for China to move forward. But, of course, that's a decision Beijing is going to have to make for itself.
China is responding by accusing the U.S. of spreading, quote, disinformation and blaming it for prolonging the war by providing Ukraine with weapons. The U.S., of course, has adamantly defended its aid to Ukraine in response to Putin's invasion and alleged war crimes. Meanwhile, Beijing is trying to position itself as a neutral mediator in the war in Ukraine. Last week, unveiling a so-called peace plan that calls for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine and the end of sanctions on Russia. President Zelensky says he wants to meet with the Chinese president. The U.S. and the West, however, have dismissed the plan as too favorable towards Moscow. President Biden telling ABC News that he has not seen anything in the plan that would be beneficial for anyone other than Russia. And National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had this to say about it yesterday.
China put forward this plan without having had a single conversation since the war began between President Xi and President Zelensky. The Chinese have talked to the Russians a lot, but at the most senior levels, they have not talked to the Ukrainians. And it's very difficult to advance any kind of peace initiative when there's that kind of one-sided diplomacy going on.
Joining me now on set is my colleague at the White House correspondent Monica Alba. Courtney Kube is at the Pentagon. Aaron McLaughlin is in Kyiv, and Garrett Haake is at his post on Capitol Hill. Monica, I have to start with you and this new reporting that we got over the weekend that this aid that China is considering includes ammunition and artillery potentially to Russia. Jake Sullivan says they haven't seen any evidence that China has taken that step yet. But what are you hearing? What are your sources telling you about this?
Yeah, that is the assessment of the U.S. government at this time, Kristen, that this is still a high-stakes hypothetical, that China has not made the decision to transfer weapons to Russia. But what are we really talking about here when we mention artillery, ammunition? Potentially, these would be weapons that could be used on the battlefield that would increase the bloodshed in Ukraine. And so the U.S. is being very clear in its warning, sending to China, if you do decide to do this, there will be severe consequences. And that is why you've seen everybody from the Secretary of State to the UN ambassador to even the president saying, again, we haven't assessed that this is happening, but should China take this additional step, there will be severe ramifications. And we're talking about things here like potential sanctions and like other things that we haven't seen yet when it comes to China in this larger context and Russia's war invading Ukraine. But it's clear that the U.S. is being out front with what it knows from its limited intelligence and sending that sign, again, trying as best as it can to deter China from doing this.
And I think you make the important point, Monica, which is that this is really a chorus of voices that we are hearing saying this. In fact, UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield told Andrea Mitchell last week that China sending lethal aid to Russia would be a, quote, game changer. I mean, talk about this level of escalation. To your point, we could see sanctions. This would be China putting its thumb on the scale of this war in a way that we just have not seen yet.
It would be incredibly significant. And you're seeing some overtures, certainly from President Putin, who had China's top diplomat visiting and having these very high-level conversations there. So you're seeing some signs on the world stage of where that relationship could potentially be going. But at the same time, the U.S. has been very clear. They sense here that Russia and China are trying to have it two ways, that publicly China is trying to put forth this 12-point, what they call a peace proposal, while privately having these conversations about supplying them with these weapons. Those two things the U.S. says do not square.
Yeah, and that is why there's just so much skepticism about that peace proposal, Monica. Courtney, let me turn to you. Let's talk about the military aid that has been sent and that hasn't been sent. The U.S. has escalated the amount of military aid that it sent recently, announcing that it's going to be sending those Abrams tanks along with European allies. But President Zelensky continues to put the focus on the F-16 fighter jets. Jake Sullivan over the weekend told Chuck, when he was pressed repeatedly about this, that, look, there are no plans to send F-16 fighter jets at this point in time. What are your sources telling you? Could that change? What would change the calculation?
So I would point back to the decision on those Abrams tanks, Kristen. Remember, there were people who were saying there was no decision to do that 72 hours before the announcement was made that the U.S. was going to send Abrams tanks. So these decisions can change very quickly. I will say there is a growing chorus of people, particularly on the Hill in Congress, who are calling for the F-16s to go to Ukraine. But at this point, according to administration officials who we're speaking with, the decision hasn't been made. What the military is really focused on right now are what I call the 4 A's. So one is ammunition. Ukraine needs a ton of ammo. They are going to keep needing ammo as long as this conflict is going on. They are running through thousands of rounds a day. Second is artillery, and that is not just the artillery launchers, but the ammunition, the shells, exactly what it is that the U.S. is concerned China may be considering sending to Russia, because, frankly, both sides really need the artillery. The third, air defenses. There is a lot of concern that in the coming offensive by Russia, they will employ their air forces. The Ukrainians really need something that will defend on the ground from any onslaught from Russia in the skies, and that also includes things like drones and missiles that they could potentially use. Then the fourth one, as we've been talking about, armor, tanks. They're going to need more and more armored and tanks for this counteroffensive, particularly when Russia starts moving towards them. The Russians are very dug in their defensive lines, and the Ukrainians need the ability to break through those lines if and when this spring offensive really kicks into high gear, Kristen.
Court, great reporting from the Pentagon there. Garrett, let me turn to you and get your perspective from Capitol Hill. There is a sense, based on conversations that I have had, that the U.S. is giving Ukraine enough to stay in this war, but not enough to win the war. Obviously, a myriad of different perspectives on Capitol Hill. But to the point that Courtney is making, I mean, what are you hearing about the level of support for sending F-16s, for ramping up the military aid the U.S. is giving even more?
Well, this is where there's a really interesting division in the Republican Party in particular, between Republicans who'd like to see the U.S. get out of the Ukraine, sort of Ukraine backing business altogether. Some of the members on the far right, like your Marjorie Taylor Greenes and your Matt Gaetzes. But then there's some of the more establishment Republicans, including Michael McCaul, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to even some of the folks who are running for president, like Mike Pence, who've said that if we're going to be in this, we need to give Zelensky and the Ukrainians whatever tools they need, up to and including the F-16s. Now, as Courtney laid out, there's some division within our own government whether those are necessary or not. But this division within the Republican Party is interesting because if you want to look at it purely politically, there's two different ways to hit Joe Biden on Ukraine. You can hit him by saying he's gone too far, or you can hit him by saying he's not gone far enough. House Republicans alone are doing both. Now, Democrats have largely kind of had Joe Biden's back on this. To the degree there's division within that party, there tends to be a desire to see more be given all at once rather than just give the Ukrainians enough to sort of lose more slowly or stay in the fight longer. Now, whether any of this amounts to a significant push either from the right or the left to speed up the pace of weapons transfers, to speed up the pace of providing additional tools and resources to the Ukrainians, I think remains to be seen. This is still Joe Biden's show. The question is kind of how easily or more difficult will it be to drag Congress along the next time the White House sends an aid request down here to Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I think that is going to be the new front in this fight, Garrett. How long can the White House keep the support of Congress when it comes to asking for more aid packages? Aaron, let me go to you in Kyiv. And Monica's reporting on the skepticism here within the Biden administration about a potential meeting between Zelensky and President Xi about this proposed peace plan. What are you hearing there about whether Zelensky thinks this could be serious? I mean, is he going to this meeting thinking that this could yield some type of breakthrough?
Well, Kristen, President Zelensky says he'd like to meet with President Xi, but there's no visit at present scheduled on the books for either leader that has been made public. And it is worth pointing out that tomorrow, the leader of Belarus, a close Putin ally, Alexander Lukashenko, is expected in Beijing. China is much closer to Russia than it is to Ukraine. Now, in terms of the peace plan itself, in that press conference last Friday, President Zelensky was markedly reserved in his language about that, but his most senior advisors have not been. I have a tweet here from Mihailo Podolyak, a senior advisor, calling out China, essentially saying, quote, if you claim to be a global player, you don't offer an unrealistic plan. You don't bet on an aggressor who broke international law and will lose the war. It's not far-sighted. As someone who plans for decades, doesn't play Russia three-day games, China, the window of opportunity is not endless, and certainly it's a representation of how other Ukrainians feel as well.
Well, it's going to be fascinating. I think you hit the key point there. There's still no meeting scheduled. Aaron, let me follow up with you, though, because you've got some new reporting on explosions in Mariupol. What can you tell us? What are you learning?
Yeah, that's right. The British Ministry of Defense tweeting about this morning. In the last 6 days, there has been at least 14 explosions in the Russian-controlled port city of Mariupol. And that's significant because that is seen as a major base of operations for the Russians to the south. Now, I was speaking to a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Forces, and he was telling me that that is the result of intelligence on the ground, civilians, Ukrainians, informing Ukrainian military in whatever way they can about positions of Russian military bases, Russian fuel depots, Russian warehouses, and then the Ukrainians taking drones and targeting that Russian infrastructure that's seen, according to this spokesperson, as key to them being able to prevent a number of attacks over the anniversary of the invasion. And that's all significant because it was previously thought that Mariupol was about 10 kilometers outside of the reach of those U.S.-supplied HIMARS that we talked so much about in the past. It was thought that this was sort of a safe haven for Russian forces from that kind of attack, but clearly no longer the case. And this spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Ministry telling me that once they get those longer range weapons that had been promised as part of a $2 billion package most recently announced by the United States, we'll know it. He thinks that'll be a potential game changer for them in their ability to be able to target some of these Russian-controlled areas, so-called safe havens that they've had before.
Well, all of it just underscores that as we enter this second year, the war in Ukraine showing no signs of slowing down. Garrett, let me go back to you because we are getting this new information from the Department of Energy that has now assessed they believe that the origins of COVID may have in fact been in a lab in Wuhan, and yet they say they've assessed that with low confidence. We know that the China Select Committee is meeting tomorrow night. Can you give us the reaction on Capitol Hill and what we anticipate coming out of that hearing tomorrow?
Well, there's been some cheering from the far right about this assessment, although, as you point out, it is made with low confidence. It's not decisive by any measure. But, until recently, the idea that COVID might have escaped from a laboratory was treated as a conspiracy theory. And far-right Republicans, largely the ones who were most confident that was the case, were routinely mocked for espousing it. But one Republican who was kind of a critical voice on that was Tom Cotton, who tweeted about it. It doesn't matter. He says that he was right. Again, something that has not been determined. But what matters is that China is held accountable. Now, the chairman of that China Select Committee just spoke to reporters a short time ago, and he said that the origins of COVID is not necessarily something that his committee is going to spend a lot of time on. What we may see from that committee, and it won't be tomorrow night, which is going to be more of an opening argument for this China Competition Committee more broadly, but what we may see from that committee is a deeper dive on the idea of a cover-up, that whatever China knew about where COVID came from, why they made it so hard for the rest of the world to make these assessments and to study whether or not it developed naturally or from a lab. That's the kind of thing that that committee is particularly interested in digging into. And Kristen, it sounds like they're going to have a lot more opportunity and interest from the wider country, I think, to explore that topic after this news over the weekend. I
think you are absolutely right about that. Courtney, weigh in here. What are your sources at the Pentagon telling you about the broader implications of this finding by the DOE, again, which has assessed this with low confidence? And we should say that John Kirby from the White House press briefing room, from the podium there, saying that there has been no final determination about the actual origins.
Right. And remember, I think a lot of our viewers may not realize that a lot of assessments are a low confidence assessment, because that's not uncommon here. But, you know, it's also not been a surprise that this is something that the U.S. government and others have been looking into, this possibility of exactly how whether COVID may have come out of this lab. This is something that we were first reporting on almost 3 years ago now, Kristen, the potential that they were looking into this. Now, I will say here, out of the Pentagon, we're not getting any comment. It's just not really in their lane. But this also goes to the larger issue of these relations, this back and forth between the U.S. and China. It's an extremely tense time. The fact that this is coming out now, none of this happens in a vacuum, Kristen.
Monica, you've been working this story over the weekend. What are folks at the White House saying?
I think something that we've heard over and over again from many in the administration and from U.S. officials who have been steeped in this now for years is that we may truly never know the actual origins of this pandemic, that it will continue to be studied and investigated by all of these agencies. But you do see this major split between even the FBI, which has assessed apparently with moderate confidence this potential lab leak theory. You now have the Department of Energy with low confidence, but you have a bunch of other agencies that essentially are in a different corner, saying this was more likely a natural transmission to humans. So this division could continue. It's something that President Biden has directed all of the agencies and the whole federal government to continue to look at. But the reality is there may not be a clear answer. Now, that doesn't take away any of the politics and the debate that will continue. But as for the actual scientific matter here, we may never get to the exact bottom of it now, 3 years into this health crisis, Kristen.
Great reporting all around. Monica, Courtney, Aaron, and Garrett, thank you all so much for that powerful start to the show.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.